curtain in the dormitory, and put the prism against the beam of light which was coming in, and this is how he split the light. And his name was Isaac Newton. I know this is not true, but it sounds really great. He did differently, but that's also a great connection with multispectral imaging and what we do on the Newton papers. And then in 1970s, there was another Cambridge Connections where they reused that image and tried to maybe not explain it, but for the art, the Pink Floyd with the album The Dark Side of the Moon. But in real, the beam of light, the visible light, once it's split, it goes from blue to red, as we know, and it goes through all the colors. Now, if you look further into towards the blue end, we'll have the waves of the ultraviolet rays, and if you go further into the red, we'll then start recording the infrared rays. And this is basically the range in which we are working, because if you go much further, then you get X-rays and gamma rays, or the microwaves even the other end. So the light is the wave, like every other wave, like sound as well. And what's important for multispectral imaging is how human vision differs from what camera sees. As humans, we evolved in a way that if there is something which is vaguely a bit more orange than it should be, you can see on that that diagram here, then we already perceive that as red color. We don't really see much further into red wavelengths. Now, the cameras are built to be much more linear in that way. So this is why the peaks they are divided in even spacing. So what we have to do as well is to translate what we see, what the camera captures into what we see when we do normal photography. However, that also gives us this advantage that we can use the cameras to capture more that we can see as humans. And as we have the cones at the back of our retinas, in the same way that there are pixels on the cameras which are recording that light. And that's quite visible in, there is this nice example from 1920s when the conservator back then, or the artist in the museum, tried to repaint the pigment of the damaged painting from Picasso. And then later, yes, the photograph of it was taken in different light, and what it appeared, the pigment was not matching exactly. So what happens is that's called metamerism, this confusion of pigment, that is the phenomenon where the color of two objects appear the same under different light source, because the inks, they reflect the white light differently, sometimes giving us more information on the different waves of the light they reflect. And this is how we can differentiate that. Now, in the history of cultural heritage, we had we even have several infrared glass plates which we're using in 50s apparently, and the forensic science was allowed for photographing the UV light on film. Now, in early digital, if someone wanted to have their own kind of small system, this is what we've done in the early days when we started doing this about maybe 7 years ago. We could replace the filter which is in front of the camera, which blocks some of that red light which is coming into the sensor, and then we can use what you see here, the little filters. They have the markings which are saying they only pass certain wavelength in, so we could filter different layers of the light. In that creative way, we could learn something about the objects we work with. And that's the image of our setup back then, when we had little tiny camera modified this way, and we're photographing different different objects. We had to manually change the filters in front of the lens, which is very cumbersome, very difficult to do. It takes time, and you might introduce the shake of the camera or the change of the position, which is then basically you have to do it again. So it wasn't ideal, but that was the way to do it. And we had one project which benefited from this, which I wanted to show because it also shows how the multispectral light works on that level. We had the so-called nominal roll. This is the sequence of images, how they looked like when we were capturing with the camera modified like that. When you photograph that nominal roll, this is the regular kind of visible and near UV light. There was this damage in the very corner of it, which you could not see with the bare eye. Therefore, we had to photograph it sequentially every 20 pages or so to see how far that damage has been introduced, and you cannot do it any other way. And the paper was very brittle, so we couldn't really touch it. And conservators then used our images to apply it as a template for fixing that issue. And you could see here in that image from 500 nanometers, where the light is fluorescing, so it means we also used UV light, that in that corner which was damaged, there was no light response. Therefore, we didn't collect any data, but it showed us as the kind of dark corner, which was very strong indication that this is where the damage is, invisible damage otherwise, and we could create those templates. Now, that has changed with a couple of years ago. We received funding from HRC, where we purchased a very high-end multispectral imaging system from the company called Megavision in America. And they have many more components. It's much more advanced way of manage the lights. First of all, we have LED narrowband lights, which means that the lights they emit, it goes in one particular wavelength. Therefore, we don't have to use the filters to have this slices of different light through the sequence of images. And the other thing, which was huge improvement, also big digital bag, which was monochrome and designed for astral photography, therefore very sensitive, and all the pixels were they used to record the detail of the scene we're photographing. Then we also have so-called apochromatic hyperspectral lens, purpose designed for that medium format digital bag. Set of wheels, which were used for one of the sequences. I will talk about it a little bit later. And different light sources as well in different positions. So the main sequence, the visible UV and infrared light, they come from those main banks, we call them. But also what we see here, this is the raking light panel. So there we have the light which is coming from the side, and we have very thin transmissive light sheet. And I'm going to explain that in a second as well. But before I go, I will just play you a little video to show how that works. And that was the first time I was working with like kind of try to find the protocol, the good way of photographing the watermark. And you can see the whole sequence took about back then, I think 10, 12 minutes maybe. It's a time lapse. But then at the end, just from the photography, even not with much of processing, you could sometimes see very well the watermarks. So that was the first time I managed to do that on that system, and that was exciting. Now, I wanted to go to the next slide, which is here. So to say a bit more what this system does and what have you just seen, what happened was, first there was a sequence on main base, so those lights on the top. And then we had lights which were mainly using UV source light, but with different filters which are in that filter wheel, and that is to capture the fluorescence of the ink and the paper and everything which is there. So I also found a diagram which explains what the fluorescence is, because we call the regular light as we see it, or as we photograph it, irregular in the regular camera, is reflected light. So it just comes in, whatever, if the ink is yellow or the page is yellow, then yellow light will reflect, right? Now, with fluorescence, it's a bit different, because the UV lights, they carry some amount of energy, which then makes those inks or things which are in the spectrum fluoresce a little bit more. So then you gather a bit more information. Those images are slightly different. And then if you use the filters in between the camera and this, you can filter it even more. So it might be sometimes very interesting results. This is why it's really worth trying that. Now, there are raking lights as well come at the end, and the transmissive light, and that comes also in different bands. And the most important is that the transmissive light, which obviously are very important for watermarks, because this is this light sheet, thin light sheet to put between the pages, that emits the infrared light. And I'm gonna mention that in a minute as well, because that's from our Cairo Geniza collection, which you might be familiar with, I hope. That shows very well what can infrared light do. So in those scripts, you can see that later on, probably from the time when the manuscript was written, there might have been some accents added to the script, and they were with different ink. So one of the thing about inks is that the chemical composition is, when they are made from plant-based components, for instance, they tend to fade a little bit more in infrared if they contain something like carbon. Carbon is visible through all the spectrums, and this is what makes them darker, and they don't reflect, they don't fluoresce, and they block everything. So that's one way to show what that infrared light source is useful for. So for the watermark images, so the sequence I showed you before takes about 10 minutes. Now, for watermark images, we thought, oh, we want something a bit more effective. So we're going to do design for the project. The sequence, which is a bit different, is quicker. It only takes just over a minute. And it contains some of the main base reflectance images. These are the ones we use to make a composite color picture, which I show you in a minute as well. Then we use the infrared from 700 to 940, and then transmissive from 500 to 940, only for lights. And on the in red, I highlighted the ones which are really important and we discovered to work very well. And what they do basically is when explaining those sequences. First, reflectance. There will be 9 images like that, and we can make them to create the we artificially create the color image, which is actually very color accurate, right? Because it doesn't have just red, green, and blue like the regular camera does. We use the Hull sensor to create 9 different bands in the sequence, which then results as a very accurate color image. The transmissive lights look a bit more like that, and you can see straight away that the one in the left bottom corner is going to be the one which is the furthest in infrared, because some of the ink fades the most. And now the raking light, we decided to take it for reference at the end. We had a bit higher hopes for using it, especially in infrared, but to see that maybe the you can just about to see the lines of the paper texture, but also the creases there on the way as well. So for reference, sometimes it might be useful, but it didn't benefit directly the discovery of those images. So I highlighted to you. So yeah, 60% of success is photographing the right sequence in the right way, and then a lot of post processing may help. And there are a few ways of doing the post processing on those multispectral images, or as they called image cubes. We use the open source software designed by Keith Knox, who's a great scientist working in cultural heritage, multispectral imaging for years. He created that you could go ahead and find it online and download it and experiment with that. It has very clear instructions how to do things. You could also use something like ImageJ. We did tested that, or something like NV geospatial software, but this one is quite expensive proprietary software. So I think sometimes it might be good to use the mix of all. On this project, the TNA, they use ImageJ mainly, but they also have different system. So this is what works for them the best. At the end of the day, the outcome is try to extract the watermark and try not to see as much abstractions as the writing which occurs on the other side of the page, etc. Now, the basic post-processing of watermarks is basically to do some kind of image math on those images, because at the end of the day, the digital images are the numbers on which you can make mathematical equations and calculations. And it might be subtraction, it might be division, it might be this kind of this kind of recipe which will work the best for the particle setup. We found the division works very well with our images. And how it looks like is this 940 infrared, when the writing is already faint in the reflectance light. So the one which just hits and reflects back to the camera, whatever parts of the image are excited by it. Now the transmissive 940, which you can see that it has still a little bit of writing. It's a bit more faded here as well, because the light is quite strong underneath, but you can still see the writing. You already can see the watermark, but to be honest, this text was neither difficult in terms of having a lot of carboning, for instance, or didn't have many obstructions there. And then once we calculate one image by the other, then we'll receive this much clearer photograph of very well visible watermark, chain lines, laid lines of the mold. Still some text obstructive text could be there, especially if it's on the other side of the image. But most of the text you can cancel with this post-processing recipe we found. So that would be probably the best possible image we can create with the system, and something which we found out works very well. And that's about it. Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who's been working on the project, photographers and people who shared their knowledge with us, like Keith Knox, Ivan Shevchuk, and Kale and Haskin from Hamburg University, who are specialists also in Europe for this kind of imaging. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maciej. Hugh, now the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Maciej. So that's about generating images, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might use the images, the kinds of images which Maciej has generated. I'll just get this started. Hang on. Okay, so yes, we've seen how images of watermarks can be generated. And now I want to talk a bit about how we might use those images. I think it's worth pointing out right from the start that there's a kind of iterative relationship in a sense between producers of digital content like Maciej and the studio and the users of digital content, in that quite often there's quite a lot of back and forth between the needs of research and the technology, which is quite an exciting kind of circle of as the technology advances, the research questions change, and we need more and different images from Maciej. But I particularly wanted to talk about how those images of watermarks address the research question of our project, and that is quoting from our bid to give us a better idea of the chronology and organization of the papers of Isaac Newton. The dispersal of Newton material through the sale room in the 20th century has made accurate comparison of the physical evidence extremely difficult, generating a puzzle in terms of the historical order of the collection. And I suppose what we're investigating really is how might a set of images of watermarks, which are linked to accompanying metadata, alongside some existing tracings made of the Newton watermarks, might help us to solve this puzzle. So it might help us to generate new information about the organizational chronology of Newton's papers. And then in a wider sense, how in doing this, we might think about generalizable methods for using a combination of investigative imaging, computer vision, and metadata to use physical aspects of material to generate new information about these manuscripts. So I suppose that our methodology, broadly speaking, fits into what is sometimes known as quantitative codicology, which is looking at physical characteristics of collection at scale. So broadly speaking, the core method we have, and I suppose both with watermarks and generally for quantitative codicology, is comparison. So how far is an aspect of one thing either exactly the same or similar to the same aspect of another thing? So we might, people look at the size, people look at color, people look at things like the script, and in our case, we're looking at watermarks. And there's, I suppose, going from the small to the large, in our case, we can achieve this at the simplest level by comparing one watermark with another, or at a larger scale by comparing a single watermark against a known data set of watermarks, so a large data set of watermarks, such as Briquet, or by comparing within a data set of watermarks to find those which are similar, so clustering together things which are similar without reference to an external data set. But whichever one of these techniques we use, I suppose what we're doing is within those matches, then using instances of watermarks for which we do have a date, for instance, watermarks on letters, which very often have dates, to extrapolate across watermarks which match those watermarks to hypothesize that texts on pieces of paper which share watermarks with dated material might, and the might is very important, share similar dates. The might is very important. What we actually establish, in fact, is that the paper on which the texts are written come from the same paper stock, which is quite a different thing to saying that both of the texts on the sheets of paper share the same date, but it does provide new information which informs research on dating texts. And as always with digital humanities, the technology doesn't necessarily give answers. In fact, very rarely gives definite answers, but rather raises new sets of questions. Before going any further, it's worth making an important distinction here between identifying types of watermark and using watermarks to identify paper which was produced using the same mold, what are sometimes known as mold mates. If you look at these three watermarks here, they're all of the same type, but are they mold mates? Are they exactly identical? And as you can see, it's sometimes quite difficult to tell with the naked eye, even with very good images. As Johnson, Satharis, and Ellis point out, matching types of watermark is not that difficult using computer vision. But unfortunately, just matching the type doesn't give you too much new information, really, or useful information, other than a possible earliest date, if that type of watermark came into use at an identifiable time. Identifying mold mates, so watermarks which are exactly the same, paper from the same stock, is much, much more useful, particularly in answering our research question about generating hypotheses about paper and the text on them. But unfortunately, it's much, much more difficult, and it's a hard problem for computer vision. And here's a short explanation of why. Essentially, there are, in the first instance, a lot of different types of watermark in the first place. And then on top of that, there are subtle, sometimes almost invisible differences within types, which indicate that sheets of paper might be mold mates. And then on top of that, if that wasn't bad enough, even good images of watermarks, such as those produced by Maciej, are comparatively cluttered and noisy when you compared them, for instance, to images of woodcuts, or other kinds of prints where computer vision does a very good job of identifying both identical and similar images. So even with Maciej's imaging techniques, these are very good images of watermarks, but you can see that there's quite a lot of noise and clutter. Also, the text is not the same way up as the watermark, and there's some damage to the page, etc. So these aren't simple images to deal with. An additional challenge, which we find a lot in our data set, is that often a sheet will only contain a section of a watermark, as you can see here. I hope you can also see in this image, which is something I'll come to later on, is that as well as the watermark, there's quite a lot of extra information in that image, which might tell us something about the construction of the sheet, all those lines. And another challenge that we face and other projects face, which are trying to use watermarks in a similar way, is that often existing data sets are not images. They're things like tracings or drawings of watermarks, and these are very valuable, and we don't want to just discard these data sets. Matching images of watermarks with drawings of watermarks is something, raises a problem that's known in computer vision as cross-domain matching. So matching patterns with very different, which are recognizable to the human eye as being similar or the same, but raise serious problems for computer vision. And in our project, we have a fairly large and useful existing data set of watermarks, which were made by Alan Shapiro, and here's an example of that. And we want to keep these in the project because they would be very useful for us to be able to match our new images with them. So that's all the problems. So now let's have a look at some of the solutions. Given the evident value of identifying mold mates to research and all of the attendant problems in doing so, what are the current approaches to using images of watermarks to tell us new things about collections? I'm now going to take you through a few existing approaches to watermark matching and recognition and talk through how they might fit with our project and its aims. And I'll start with a technique which I suppose most closely mirrors traditional research practice, which is overlaying watermark images. So these images here are from the Getty-funded project, which was called Applying Digital Image Processing Algorithms to the Study of Prints and Drawings. And they produced two tools which allow you to accurately compare images of watermarks. So there's a tool which allows you to mark a series of points into watermark images that you're interested in. So that's the two images on the left. And then there's another tool which uses these points to create an accurate visual overlay of the two watermarks, which is the image on the right. Now, this is very good for picking up those subtle differences, those barely perceptible differences, which are crucial in finding mold mates. And if you look at the GIF on the right-hand side for a little while, I'd like you to, it's quite mesmerizing after a while watching it change. It would be interesting to get opinions on whether these are mold mates or not. Certainly the watermarks, the images are not identical. So it's very good for verification of matches. So picking up on these subtleties, which are often difficult to see, but too time consuming to scale up to even medium-sized data sets of watermark images. Which brings us on to our next example, the VISE, or Visual Search Engine, developed by the Visual Geometry Group at Oxford, which does try to do matching at scale. Oops, sorry, we're going the wrong way. Which does try to do matching at scale and is able to deal with thousands of images at any one time. VISE fulfills one of our project aims in that it does not check against an existing data set of watermarks to identify which type of watermark is. We're not all that interested, as I said earlier, just in identifying types of watermark. That's not really going to give us too much new information, which will be helpful in creating a sense of the chronology and organization of the papers. So, but what VISE does is it simply compares a set of images to find ones which it thinks are either identical or similar. And you kind of choose an accuracy setting and presents them back to the user. So in a sense, it performs the kind of clustering of watermarks which we're interested in for our project. So if you give VISE 1,000 images of watermarks and you identify a watermark, it will give you the 100 watermarks which match that watermark. So then you have a cluster of 100 images which might come from paper which shares the same data, or at least comes from the same paper stock. Now, the most prominent use of VISE in cultural heritage so far has been for collections of woodblock prints. And I suppose the easiest way to show how it works is to show you a quick demonstration. So I hope you can all still see that. Can I get confirmation that that's visible? If I don't get confirmation, I'll just... Brilliant. Okay. So here you can see that VISE has now ingested 6,599 images of woodblock prints from the UL's collection. And the way it works is you feed in an image you're interested in, you feed in the part of the image you're interested in, and you search. And it goes through the data set, and in the first instance, it gives you things which it thinks are identical. So let's click here. So it thinks this woodblock print is identical to that. It says, here is the query. This is the image we fed in. Here is the match. And here are the two overlaid on top of each other. So you can check. Does it look like the same print? The same print? Well, I'll leave it up to you to decide. It also then allows you to look at other matches which it thinks are similar but not identical. So in our instance, this would be watermarks of the same type but not from the same mold. So again, we can see here that it's kind of similar but identifiably different. Oh, actually, hang on a minute. I think I clicked on the wrong thing there. That's still similar, but hopefully, oh, let's click on this one quickly. Yes. Anyway, and then it gives you an idea of the things which match. So that, I suppose, you look at that. Oh, you can see then that this is identifiably a different block, but of the same kind of iconography. Okay, if I go back to my PowerPoint. So we can see that it performs well in identifying prints which seem to be exactly the same or similar. However, as Lucia Pereira Pardo and Giles Burgell pointed out in a blog article for the National Archives, that the technology that this uses doesn't transfer unproblematically to our problem, which is watermarks. So it performs well, as we can see here, when matching types of watermarks, but was less successful in identifying the kind of subtle differences needed to identify mold mates. So it's quite good at getting the type, but the type isn't all that interesting for us. And it's not good at that cross-domain matching. So it's not very good at matching an image of a watermark with a tracing of a watermark. Now, this has been pointed out as a kind of general problem with trying to match watermarks at scale. So returning to Johnson, Satharis, and Ellis, who say the goal of such fully automated schemes is limited, or was limited when they wrote this, to finding similar watermarks rather than mold mates. For instance, when given an eagle watermark, they will identify other eagles. They return plausible matches, but the problem is more difficult if we begin with two watermarks of the same type and try to determine if they're exact matches, which is what we want to do. Let's check the time. Okay. So the third project I'd like to talk about is the Filigrane Portu project, members of which are actually partners on our current project from the École Nationale des Chartes and the École de Pont Paris Tech. Now, this project attempted to deal with some of the problems raised about accurate matching and cross-domain matching at scale by employing slightly different techniques from computer vision to the usual ones which are employed by DIEs. So I'm not an expert on computer vision, so I'm kind of just reading this next sentence out. But what the difference, and if you're interested, then you can look it up, or you can follow our project to see how we get along with it. But essentially, the differences are that they use mid-level features of images rather than a technology called SIFT. Now, as far as I understand that, rather than looking at points of high contrast, they in an image in order to find matches, they look at the general shape of an image, so they're more interested in shapes than in points of comparison. And also introducing spatial consistency into the matching in order to prove accuracy. So that means that this system takes into account not just the individual features of watermarks match, but also that the spatial arrangement of these matches, i.e. the overall shape of the watermark match, is the same too, which begins to give us the kind of accurate matching needed to identify mold mates. And if you look down here, particularly this might be quite small, but here they've fed in a watermark as a query, and it has identified from these watermarks of the same type that this query exactly matches within that type these shapes. And again, here are some different queries. So they seem to be having some success in addressing one of the big problems, general problems, I think, in computer vision and watermarks, which is matches which are accurate enough to give you mold mates. Where it differs from the aims of our project is that it's trained to recognize watermarks against an established data set of recognized watermarks. So essentially it's doing lookups against a set of watermarks that it knows about. And that's, for various reasons, not exactly, or at least, I mean, that would work to a certain extent with our project, but we want to try at least something different. So it will say, this new watermark you've given me matches this existing watermark in my database. So it gives you a kind of reference, but it won't allow you to feed in 1,000 watermarks and say, these 100 watermarks I think might be mold mates. So it won't allow you to generate clusters of matching mold mates at scale. So where does that leave us in our project? Well, probably it's trying to combine something from all three methods. So taking that fine-grained cross-domain image matching techniques developed by the Filigrane Plot2 project, using those slightly different approaches from computer vision, and then integrating it into something which looks a bit like the kind of user-friendly clustering search with comparison provided by VISE, and then also providing the kind of detailed overlays we saw in the first slide, which will allow us to check individual matches to see if they really are mold mates rather than simply very similar instances of the same watermark, the type of watermark, sorry. So before I finish, I'd just like to briefly talk about another approach which uses the same images, the same kinds of images, but doesn't use the watermark. Rather, it uses the lines left on the paper by the shape of the mold itself, the chain line intervals, which are the vertical lines you see going across here, and the laid line density, so the laid lines are the horizontal lines, to try and establish which pieces of paper are mold mates. Now, people are working on this, and this work builds on the work in using thread counting to identify paintings which have been painted on the same roll of canvas, which has been successful in identifying roll mates, as it were, in the work of Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Vermeer. So there's a technique from art history using similar techniques, which actually is proven to be successful. Now, previous work using laid line density has been hampered by image quality, but it may be that the very high resolution multispectral images of the kind that Maciej is now producing are able to produce successful results using this technique. And very finally, some thoughts for future work. So firstly, there's been some successful work in the use of computer vision with woodblocks in trying to establish a chronology of impressions which are made by the same block. So by looking at evidence for the deterioration of the block. It may be that the kind of very accurate matching we see with the overlay matching procedure could do the same kind of thing in arranging mold mates, so things created by the same mold chronologically within that set by looking at deterioration of the watermark and the mold itself. So we might be able to actually go within the clusters of mold mates to actually try and see if we can arrange them also chronologically. So that's the first thing we're thinking about for the future. And secondly, another possibility is once we have an established set of watermarks for the Newton material, i.e. patterns which we know we're looking for, it would be interesting to see if we can use computer vision to search the very many existing reflected light images of the kind we see here for these patterns. So it would be interesting to see if we have a set of patterns we're looking for, whether a computer can look into these images and see very subtle patterns which might indicate that they share the watermark, which may preclude the need for the new imaging of all material. It might be that one only needs to create the multispectral images for a certain percentage of material in order to apply it across reflected light images too. That's a very experimental and rather a reach, but it's certainly worth experimenting with because it would be truly significant for the study of collections at a huge scale at a comparatively small cost. So thank you for listening, and that's the end of my presentation.
Would you like to conclude our session, the whole series somehow? Or
Yes,
do you have any?
Yes, I will come to the conclusion, but first I will open the discussion. If anybody has questions, please address them. Otherwise, I will just have a few questions for you, Maciej and Hughes. First of all, thank you for the fascinating talks that you just gave us. My first question is about a mold mate. Do we have an idea of the proportion of mold mates within a given set of watermarks? I mean, what are we looking for here? Is it a tiny portion, or can we hope for more than just a small fraction of it?
Well, I think that probably Scott Mandelbrot, who's also here, might be better placed to answer the question. But I think that we will get mold mates because we will have, because within the papers there will be sequences of within single items which are definitely on the same paper. So that will be a good test case. So if you have a letter which is 3 sheets, which uses 3 sheets, then that gives us a test case for there's a good chance that those are actually mold mates. So I think that we would definitely have mold mates within the collection, and things we can test methods for identifying mold mates on. How many mold mates we have which transcend single items in the collection, I think, is one for the Newton experts, and maybe something which we'll discover during the project.
Because we understood from your talk that mold mates is somehow the ideal case, and but it's as any ideal, it's not so common to be realized. So I would like to ask you if looking at classes of watermarks is not enough already to give new information, in a sense that it may allow us to put up a chronology within a set of papers or within a set of manuscripts, which could already inform us a lot without even having a mold mate.
I think that it depends on the longevity of that type of watermark and how easy it is to establish when it first came into use. So if you have a watermark which is comparatively short-lived and you've got a good idea when it started, then it's almost as good as a mold mate. But if you have something which was around for a long time and you don't, then yes. So yes, it would give useful new information, and it shouldn't be discarded as an aim, certainly.
But I don't think that we're very likely to have categories of watermarks like that within the Newton corpus, unfortunately. I mean, our problem, and the problem which is clearly apparent actually from Shapiro's work, is the extent to which very similar kinds of watermark are being reused by makers of paper, and possibly copied by different makers of paper over long periods of time. So that actually designing something that will allow one to identify mold mates, which is extremely difficult with the naked eye, is actually going to be rather important for understanding whether this kind of technique can give you the sort of information we're looking for, or whether it actually isn't a helpful technique for trying to rearrange an archive. I believe it will be a helpful technique, and I think we will get mold mates beyond simply matches in particular items such as single letters. But I think we will also get surprises, in the sense that I think we'll find that paper that we think is similar and we think belongs to the same period of writing actually turns out to be different.
Thank you. And I have another question about your last slide, Hugh, which mentioned the combined approach of these techniques. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about which other digital approaches could be combined to this multispectral imaging.
Well, I certainly think that, so I think that taking the filigrane Portu matching and putting it in a system which clusters together rather than simply matches against the data set, I think that is achievable and would be good. I think that also having the overlay, which is something I hadn't really thought of much before, is a useful addition to that process for verifying within matches, but simply because of the very slight differences which can indicate whether something is a mold mate or not. But also if we do end up looking at deterioration of watermarks over time, then I think that having a assisted human vision is really the only way to get there, because I can't really think that a computer could do that on its own. So I think inevitably, as I said at the start, this whole thing really is an iteration between technology and research. The computers aren't going to give the definitive answers. What they'll do is they will set us questions and maybe give us tools to address them. But I think in the end, it will be kind of a Newton expert looking at something which will make the final decision. So it's a kind of union really of techniques from digital humanities and also allowing the researcher into that process.
Thank you. And Maciej, I had a question for you as well about the raking lights that you mentioned in your talk. Are you going to continue taking these raking light images, or are you discarding them in the project?
Yeah, so the first results, as I said, with the raking lights, they weren't maybe what we are hoping for, and that may also come from different reasons. One of them is the different collections are kept differently. So, for instance, a lot of UL paper, which we are looking at the watermarks, were placed in so-called guard books. So the letter with the watermark was kept between two acid-free cards for quite a long time. And my theory is that comparing to the letters I've seen, we've been photographing, which were kept loose in a box for a long period of time, these were a bit more flattened. So this is why I think it's one of the reasons why we don't see that much of the texture of the paper itself. You could, and even like, we did discuss that as well for the project, where like which side should we use? Should we identify it, which is the mold side before photography, when you could feel the texture a bit more? Now that wasn't that easy to identify on those collections to start with, because of that, I think, because how they were kept in a guard book. Now, for the imaging side of it, as with the use of infrared and the method we have at the moment, that doesn't introduces any issues, because that image can be flipped, or it's that thickness of the paper at the end of the day which matters. Now, will we continue? I think we will, because maybe experiment a little bit more with the angles as well, and set something a bit more consistent. I think that reference is always worth seeing as well, especially if you see that there is a folded creased paper, and you will understand then from the raking light that it is a crease, rather than some damage to it and things like that. Then you have a triple layer of paper, for instance, if you have the crease like that. So it's I think it's important as the reference, and we'll see whether it's going to help in the future. For record, it's definitely useful to keep it.
I completely concur to that. I completely agree with you that raking lights might be important in the future. As a record, but also for the interpretations of the content of these papers. For example, with raking lights, we are able to identify some folding patterns that correspond to editorial interventions on Newton's manuscripts. Early editors of Newton folded vertically in half papers that they would consider not relevant to the text they were trying to establish. And these papers were then unfolded by librarians or collectors in order to seem more, I don't know how to say it, in a better shape. But the trace of this folding is very important for the custodial history and for the editorial history of these papers. Also important is traces of papers folded for correspondence. For example, you would be able to recognize that a paper was folded for correspondence and to be put in an envelope and sent along letters. And it's important to know that, for example, such and such pages from Newton were circulated at the time through that medium, through that way. So it's I completely concur with that, and I think it's an important addition to multispectral imaging.
Yeah. I think it's a very good approach for any kind of project if there is availability to capture that extra data, which shows the features of the objects and might not directly answer the research question as Hugh mentioned, but it might give additional information later on. Once we have that opportunity, we should definitely do that.
Thank you. Is there any question from our panelists or from the audience? No.
I can see the question from Robert Bell about the watermarks. It's not a question, really, but he mentioned something interesting. Other similar papers to develop the database of watermark images. This is the kind of thought I had as well. I think the challenge of the project is really high, because it's a mixed collection of papers which maybe we would like to know the origin of, or the exact dates when they were produced, etc. But it's much more difficult, and it kind of relates slightly to your question before, but it's not about Newton watermarks, but the other collections I've seen, with the bound books and early medieval paper, you can always see, once the book is bound, it was probably bound quite often from similar paper. So then the twin molds, the mold mates, they would be much more irregular, and researching that first, trying to learn from the bound books could be another angle of approach, but that's different collection again. So it's quite rare that you have the book which is made of sets of different molds altogether, especially in the earlier editions. So yeah.
But Maciej, didn't you image for us a bound notebook from King's, which would actually affect some of these issues in terms of actually giving us potentially a notebook or a collection of paper which was acquired at the same time, which we can check for mold mates and things like that.
That's right. That would be the great starting point, maybe in comparison as well. So the other angle of approach, yeah. There was the notebook. There were a couple of them actually. I think I don't remember what kind of paper they had, but yeah, if they had the mold mates, that would be probably useful to look at them first.
Another question from the audience, from Yasmin Faghiri. How do you assess the potential of the second image comparison method you mentioned, considering the scale of the collection may be within limits?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question when you start operating at scale, is how do you check the results? Because the advantage of operating at scale is that it goes beyond it's meant to make processes achievable, which would take extremely long time or be impossible to do manually. But it does raise the question of if you check all of the results, particularly when you're dealing with thousands of images, then you're also engaging in a kind of long manual process, which could kind of mirror the if you check every result, you may as well check everything physically. So I think it's a kind of general question. It's a good general question about quantitative code ecology at scale, is to what extent do you check only results which you find surprising or interesting? Do you have check them against things you already know, if you have already identified that things should be identified as mold mates, and you have other things which you know are similar but not mold mates? Do you check them to see if it's doing the right thing there, then extrapolate that it must be doing the right thing in other cases? But I think it's a very interesting question, which brings us back to the relationship between human activity and technology in this kind of realm of digital humanities, where you're bouncing back between technology and research. So yes, a good question, which I don't have an exact answer to. I think that probably that we'll find our way there through the process of actually trying to do it. But just very quickly, every method kind of has its own logic, in a sense. Doing things digitally isn't the same as doing them physically. So the kinds of results we will get out will be addressed towards the same question, but they will be different. You know, there is a difference in what you get out of digital humanities than what you would get out of doing it a different way. And I think that part of one just has to say these are the results produced by the method, and the method is the one we chose to use. So so our results are kind of contingent on an understanding of that. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hugh. Thank you, Maciej, for your talks today again. I think we're approaching the end of our allotted time, so I will just briefly sum up and conclude this series of lecture for the Newton Watermark project. We started with a very historical introduction to the whole collections of Newton papers scattered across the world. And we've ended today with a more technical approach and methodological approach to these questions. So I will just briefly, in a minute or two, sum up in some points what we've achieved so far and what our aims are. So first of all, I think watermark analysis is proving itself a very important tool to help us regroup scattered manuscripts. As we showed today, and as it has been showed in previous lectures, the comparison and the identification of classes of watermarks or of mold mates can help us identify connected sheets, connected piece of papers, and from their connected manuscripts from collections that are today separated by thousands of kilometers. Watermark analysis also brings new results in dating and reordering fragmented manuscripts or fragmented set of papers. And as such, it can help, it can be a very useful tool for critical editions of text that are scattered, of text that are barely datable. And I think from there that institutions as well as research can benefit a lot from such technologies and such research projects. And finally, I think the first results we have obtained call somehow for a systematic record of watermarks, and for this systematic record to be part of a standard cataloging practice. I hope that it will be a good argument for institution to take these codicological aspects into account in their metadata and in their cataloging practice, hopefully. So these were just a few words to sum up our series. And I should, at the end, just remind that these lectures are recorded and available online. So do not hesitate to go back to some of them or to all of them, if you like. And of course, I think every one of us here is open to discuss these topics and address questions that could be sent us via the National Library of Israel website or mail. So thank you very much for these institutions who have helped us organize this, the Cambridge University Library and the National Library of Israel. Maybe Tadeusz, I will let you conclude today's session and just say a big thank you to all of us and all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you all. I just sent the link to all recorded sessions so you can check them online and see you in our future events. Thank you very much.